On. Can you whistle?
I cannot whistle.
No one can whistle.
Yeah, whistle.
We're going to start. We're nothing if not punctual. Thanks for whistling from the crowd. I'm Kimberly. I'm the Director of Development here. Thanks for coming out and enjoying some air conditioning with us today. So just a couple quick announcements. I don't know if who receives the museum, the MOI Minute here, but if you did, you might have noticed that there's an event coming up on July 31st, and it's the Oppenheimer movie preview with a panel. I've seen some names that have already registered for that. There's 8 tickets left. So if you haven't got your tickets to that and you're interested, you have a few minutes right now on your phone to go ahead and do that. It should be good. We have a panel discussion coming. Jay Coons is going to be there. He's INL. He's a emeritus professor at ISU. And we have Sarah Roby is going to be speaking, and Richard Maservi. Yeah. Anyway, a good panel discussion, I think, will follow that movie. Also, we have MAD coming up. There's a few tickets left for that. It's on the 28th, downtown scavenger hunt. And then the next museum club will be August 3rd. And it will be Jacqueline Fonsbeck speaking about her mother, Suzanne Fonsbeck. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Eagle Rock Art Guild. She was a founding member of that, along with Fred Ochi and some others. But she has a very interesting past, including a member of the French resistance during World War II. So it's a great museum club. So anyway, on to the task at hand. This is Nathaniel Marlin. He works for the Fish and Game in Idaho Falls. He has a BS in environmental science from the University of Idaho. And he has worked the past 5 years doing habitat improvement, controlling noxious weed control, wintering ungulates, which is a fancy word for deer and elk, and migratory birds and waterfowl. I didn't know that. Everyone, new word for the day, ungulates. With the Fish and Game. And today he's going to talk about Mud Lake Wildlife Management Area and the Marty Segment Restoration. Everyone, Nathaniel Marlin. And also I have to say this, he's my nephew, so be nice.
Okay, thank you, Kim. Hello and welcome. My name, as mentioned, is Nathaniel Marlin. I am the Senior Wildlife Technician at Mud Lake Wildlife Management Area. And under the supervision and with the assistance of Brett Panting, I spend probably 90% of my work week assisting in program delivery and working to improve the habitat at Mud Lake specifically. So we should have some time at the end for questions, but if you guys think of something during the presentation, don't hesitate to ask. But without further ado, let's start looking at the history of Mud Lake. So for thousands of years, the Shoshone and Bannock tribes, as well as other indigenous groups, they found Mud Lake to be plentiful with waterfowl, large and small game, and a variety of useful and edible plants. And then later, as settlement became came to the area, fur trappers arrived, and trading posts were established at Fort Henry in 1810, and then later Fort Hall in 1834. A stage stop east of Mud Lake along route from Salt Lake to Butte, Montana was established in the year 1870. And then later with that settlement came the addition of agriculture. So beginning in the late 1800s, water from Mud Lake was used for irrigation. And by 1921, about 150,000 acres were included in these irrigation projects, excuse me. And they plan to use water from the lake to convert arid desert to productive agriculture. Here we have a historic map of Mud Lake. In its natural form, Mud Lake was filled through the addition of Camas Creek. And as Camas Creek emptied across the landscape, it would spread out and create these emergent wetland habitats. So there was still the lake itself, but we also had several other lakes to the north of the biggest body of water. And then on this right-hand side, the eastern side, you can see indicated by the green coloration that emergent wetland formed naturally in that part of the desert. And then later, due to agricultural practices and aquifer recharging on the Egenhamer Bench, that water would actually sub up in Mud Lake because it's a bottom-up system, adding even more water to the landscape and promoting even more emergent wetland. So that gets us to the establishment of the wildlife management area itself, which occurred in the year 1940. And originally, fun fact, it was named North Lake Wildlife Management Area in reference to that smaller central lake above where the main lake sits today. We are located in Territon, Idaho, and the WMA, it sits at the base of the Lemhi and Beaverhead Mountains, and it's also in close proximity to the Idaho National Laboratory. It is open year-round to public access, and the Marty Tract, which was the most recent acquisition, was acquired in 2012. We'll talk more about that towards the end, but just to get us thinking about it. Mud Lake is one of 5 wildlife management areas in the Upper Snake region. On this map, those are going to be indicated in red. And the Fish and Game also manages several other smaller properties. The purple on the map is other protected properties. Those might be managed by BLM, Forest Service, other partners. And collectively, all of these properties are going to focus on one thing, and that's habitat. And not only the habitat, but the quality of habitat. So each individual property on this map is going to serve as a puzzle piece to connect the larger ecological landscape. And that's, again, what our mission is at Mud Lake. Here we have a more updated and current map of the management area. So you can see that a lot of the landscape is dried up. The climate has become more dry, and with the addition of agriculture, the flooding of Camas Creek was contained using dikes, and that established the lake proper. So you can see a lot of those like southern bays, and even on that eastern edge, the lake itself really filled out. And today that North Lake up straight north no longer holds water, holds water at any time of year. Those other smaller lakes and reservoirs to the northwest are gone. And noticing that we needed to preserve these emergent wetland habitats, there were some wetland cells created on the eastern side of the property, kind of in this general area out in here. So another thing worth noting is there is a seasonal nesting closure on the western half of the lake, or the western half of the marsh, I should say. And that's just to protect nesting waterfowl and other nesting water birds. And that's in effect until July 15th every year. So what is Mud Lake comprised of? Well, in total, it's 11,468 acres. And to get that number, we have approximately 4,500 acres of lake and wetland habitat, another 1,000 acres of irrigated farmlands, and approximately 6,000 acres of upland habitat surrounding the lake. And because of that diverse land composition, these habitat types do create sustainable wildlife populations. And with that diverse landscape comes several diverse recreational opportunities. And as you would imagine, many of those are wildlife based. Examples would include hunting, fishing, trapping, birding, and wildlife viewing. There are other opportunities, however, that do not involve wildlife. For example, we have camping, water sports, and believe it or not, windsurfing is a very popular activity at the lake. It's actually very impressive. Those windsurfers, the moment a big wind hits Mud Lake, they're out there. I mean, they come from all over. I don't know how they get news of it so fast, but they're there. And then you can see by our pie chart on the right, a large majority of our visitation does come in the form of hunting, followed closely by wildlife viewing, and then thirdly, water recreation. And that's a collective percentage that includes boating, kayaking, windsurfing, all those different things. One of the things that directs our management practices at Mud Lake is the selection of what we call conservation targets. And these three are some of them at Mud Lake. First on the list, we have our white-faced ibis, which, so actually I'll list them first and then I'll describe each individually. But we have our white-faced ibis, northern pintail, and the greater sage grouse. So given our presence and our resources on the landscape, we're able to target these species in our management. We're able to benefit each and every one of them at certain times of the year. So for example, the white-faced ibis, we offer significant nesting habitat as well as foraging habitat. And then with our northern pintail, although we do have breeding individuals within that population, the real key ingredient that we can offer to pintails is stopover habitat during fall migration. And then sage grouse, as we all know, that's a species of a lot of concern across the West. And because of our 6,000 acres of upland habitat, as well as some of our emergent wetland and wet meadow habitats, we're able to benefit them as well. And now we're going to take a look at, I'd say, 4 main categories of wildlife that we're going to be targeting within our management. First of which being waterfowl. So the Mud Lake Wildlife Management Area is located in the Pacific Flyway. And that flyway extends from Alaska all the way south to Patagonia. 28 species of waterfowl utilize the Mud Lake area. And really, with the exception of maybe like wood ducks and a few of your sea ducks, you could at any time see whatever species you're after. I mean, we do offer a very abundant selection of wildlife, or of waterfowl, excuse me. The lake and its surrounding wetlands provide both breeding habitat and useful stopover habitat, like I mentioned, for the pintails and other migrating waterfowl. And because of the diversity of species and the habitat we offer, it does make for an excellent waterfowl viewing and hunting destination. But we also have other migratory birds. So another 49 species of migratory birds utilize the wildlife management area and the surrounding areas to meet their habitat needs. Some of these species would include sandhill cranes, long-billed curlews, Franklin's gull, as well as a variety of songbirds, raptors, you name it, we have them. And these migratory birds, they use the area again for stopover during migration, breeding and nesting in the spring, brood rearing later in the summer, and then we also see use for the purpose of molting. Birds will come to Mud Lake, and during their molt, they'll use it as kind of a sanctuary space, so they can complete the molt, which is just a transitioning of feathers. They're growing their next set of feathers. Up next, we got our upland birds. We have 3 species of upland birds at Mud Lake, and they are the greater sage grouse, the gray partridge, and the ringneck pheasant. Our vast sagebrush steppe, perennial bunch grasses, and wet meadows all support upland bird habitat. And then the final category that really drives our management is big game. We have 5 species that can be found on the WMA, which are mule deer, white-tailed deer, the Shiras moose, Rocky Mountain elk, and pronghorn. We do have resident species or resident individuals within each of these species, but we do see a lot of migration from them as well. So at any time of the year, you could see the deer and elk, and then later in the winter, when those animals are migrating to winter grounds, we really see an intake or a large intake in large ungulates. And then for the hunters out there, we are located in Big Game Unit 63. Another one of our daily tasks at Mud Lake, and it's a way that we can further manage for those 4 categories of wildlife, is through the use of wildlife food plots. We currently have 11 wildlife food plots on the property, and they total 47 acres collectively. And the purpose of these food plots is to provide wildlife with a hyper-productive food source at critical times of the year. And some examples of these hyper-productive food sources would include plots containing cover crop, triticale, Austrian winter pea, sunflowers, pollinator mixes, and then things like corn and milo are going to be large. They produce large quantities of grain, so they make that list also. And these food plots are further supplemented by lands farmed through sharecrop agreements. And what that looks like in actuality is, as modern agriculture becomes more and more efficient, there's less food left on the landscape at the end of the year, the end of the growing season for wildlife. So we will often take our share of the crops grown on Mud Lake, and we will just leave them standing, leave all that available for wildlife. So we also, through those sharecrop agreements and on our own wildlife food plots, we're going to try to use flood irrigation whenever possible. And what that comes down to is flood irrigation puts more water on the landscape, and at the end of the day, it makes it more beneficial for wildlife. That's going to keep it there longer, collect more insects and invertebrates for birds, things like that. So we're always going to try to use and incentivize flood irrigation if we can. And then finally, these food plots, they aid in the reduction of depredation issues. I mentioned that there's oftentimes less food left on the landscape for wildlife. So if we can keep them on Mud Lake and keep them off of private landowners' haystacks or silage pits, things like that, we're in turn going to keep them out of trouble. So if we can keep them on us, they're going to be safer. Here we have an example of a food plot we've put a lot of effort into over the last couple seasons. First step in establishing this food plot was we had to get it leveled. Prior to the leveling, it wouldn't water well. We could not efficiently push water across the entire plot, so we had it professionally leveled. And we also, given the grade and the elevation of that new leveling, we had to put our ditch on the opposite end of the plot. That way the water was running according to the grade of the plot. We next had to control the weeds that were present in the plot, and we did that through both mechanical means and herbicide. You can see on the left, that's a mechanical form of weed control. And then later we had to spray out the residual or the remaining weeds and prep that for planting. And then on our right picture here, this was taken last September. In the mix we chose for this plot, because it was a fall planting, we went with triticale and Austrian pea, both of which are winter annuals, therefore they can survive the winter. And that's what it looked like going into this most recent winter. Today, this is what the plot looks like. It's about 7 acres in size. And because of that triticale being a hybrid between wheat and rye, it's going to have the grain producing abilities of wheat, but it's going to also have the environmental hardiness of rye. So it fits really well into that hyper productive food source that we're looking for. And then the Austrian winter pea is going to use that as structure, climb up to reach sunlight and therefore sweeten the plot, if you will. That picture on the right shows the height of the plot, height of the stand, and that's actually the drier end of the plot. So you can imagine if it's almost 5 feet at the dry end, up by the ditch or the moister side of the plot, that's going to be pushing 6 to 7 feet. So it's a real impressive plot. We're pleased with how that one turned out. But we also have other habitat priorities that we do on a daily basis. And the first on that list is going to be noxious weed control. Russian knapweed and Canada thistle both keep us very busy. If you know anything about the Mud Lake area, it's Russian knapweed. That stuff is all over the place. So both of those species are perennials that spread through the use of rhizomes, and they can be very difficult to control. So we keep busy with those. We also implement other habitat improvement projects, and some examples of that might be willow regeneration, grass and forb plantings, and then also tree plantings, which might come in the form of fruit-bearing trees or just shelter belts, trying to provide habitat on that open landscape. We also take a look at wildlife movement across the landscape. So in my world, what that means is fence work. We do remove a lot of fence, and that's going to occur if there is possibly an obsolete interior fence, or maybe it's a fence that's going to prevent wildlife passage. Net wire would be a good example. And not only do we remove fence, but when necessary, we do have to build fence. A good example would be a perimeter fence, dividing property lines, or anywhere, there might be a grazing allotment next door or something like that. So we do construct wildlife friendly fencing. And then throughout all of these projects, not only do those occur on the wildlife management area itself, they do also, in some cases, occur on private lands. Again, trying to connect that landscape, trying to connect those puzzle pieces. And we're always trying to improve landowner relations. So this would be a quick example of a wildlife friendly fence. And a few of the specs that you're going to want to look for on a wildlife friendly fence are, first, the overall height of the fence, 40 to 42 inches is preferred. And next we have the gap between the top wire and that second wire. 12 inches is always the standard for that. And the intention there is to prevent the hind hooves of deer and elk, possibly even moose, as they cross the fence, prevent those from getting caught in the fence. The gap and the spacing on those middle two wires isn't quite as important. You'll see those vary a little bit depending on where you're at, and depending on what the purpose of the fence is. But then when we get to our bottom wire, that is always going to be a smooth wire. That allows deer fawns, elk calves, pronghorn, things like that to cross under without injury and as easily as possible. So in addition to those habitat tasks, we also stay busy monitoring and researching the wildlife found on the property or the wildlife management area. So the Mud Lake Wildlife Management Plan aligns with 7 other statewide wildlife plans. And what that means is across the state, there's a general consensus on how we're going to manage for each of these individual categories of wildlife. And we are adhering to all of those. And one of the primary ways that we monitor wildlife is through the use of banding. So when we band waterfowl, ducks and geese, we're going to use 2 primary methods. The first of which being a rocket net, which is a explosive charge that propels a large net. And it is quite literally the best bang for your buck. That's how you're going to catch the most birds in as little time as possible. It's very efficient. But we do also capture ducks on the lake at night during molt. And that does a couple of things for us. Because it's at night, it consolidates the birds to the lake. We know they're not out foraging or in other bodies of water. They're going to come back to the lake to roost. And then because it's during molt, it allows us to more effectively capture those birds and create as little disturbance as possible. We do also ban mourning doves, and we use what we call a whoosh net to accomplish that. And that is a spring-driven net or a bungee-driven net, much smaller, and we do that very near to our headquarters at the lake, if you're familiar with where that is. And then to better understand the importance and the use of banding, here's a quote from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that states, "Managing a complex and mobile resource requires information on breeding and wintering distribution, behavior, migratory routes, survival, and reproduction. Biologists gather this information by placing uniquely numbered bands on many species of birds. These birds may be recaptured in the future by biologists or found dead by the general public, or in the case of waterfowl and other game birds, they may be harvested by hunters who then report these bands to the U.S. Geological Survey, Bird Banding Laboratory, or in Canada, the Bird Banding Office, which provides information about where this bird was banded, where it was recovered, and how long it lived. This information, or this is the information that was used to develop the flyway system that has been used to manage migratory birds since 1950. So that's just a concise summary of why we ban doves and ducks, why that's so necessary. So here we have a quick video showing the different methods used to band waterfowl at Mud Lake. Is there volume here? Can we get volume somehow? Like I said, very efficient, capture a lot of birds. A lot of times it's 100 to 150. And then these are clips from our night capture on the lake using an airboat. And it's worth noting that when we release the birds, we do go back to the general area where that box of birds was captured, just to reduce stress and ensure that they know where they're at. So then up next here, we got another quick video demonstrating the use of a whoosh net, which is what we use to capture mourning doves. And we set this off with a trip cord. It's run over to the shop. And then once there's enough birds under the bait or under the net, we can go ahead and deploy it. And those are just bungees. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on those bungees. A lot of stored energy. And then we quickly run out, calm the birds, get them put into that same box that we use for ducks, bring them back into the shop, get them out of the sun, calm them down, and then release them. So, yep, we generally small seeds like millet or milo seeds work really well. And we oftentimes will get out anywhere from 100 to 120 dove bands at Mud Lake alone every year. And then to continue the topic of wildlife monitoring, we do also conduct several migratory or migration surveys on sandhill cranes. We do a spring and a fall migration survey for shorebirds. And then we also monitor bald eagles. When necessary, we do sample for avian influenza, which is a widespread illness to waterfowl that is generally on a flyway basis. I mean, it affects the entire flyway. So if that's a concern, we do sample for that at Mud Lake. And then also on Mud Lake, we do help facilitate some graduate research projects. Since I've been there, I have helped with a songbird study or a songbird project, but that would just be one example of those research projects. But more recently, a big research effort that we've been trying to conduct is on our white-faced ibis in partnership with the Intermountain West Joint Venture and Patrick Donnelly. And why is this important? Well, historically, Mud Lake was home to one of the largest nesting colonies of white-faced ibis in the West. And that would vary slightly on the availability of water in that particular season, but in general, the Mud Lake colony is always very large. More than 12,000 breeding pairs of white-faced ibis have been observed utilizing Mud Lake and its surrounding areas. And to get that count, it has been, some research has been conducted on a local scale, you know, seeing how these Mud Lake birds forage in flooded ag fields nearby and some of their habitat preferences that way. But there has been no research at Mud Lake that looks at their continental importance or their movements once they leave Mud Lake. So last season we put out 10 GPS transmitters and we attach those to the back of these breeding adults. And this is really going to be important as we try to understand the changing agricultural landscape. Once again, flood irrigation is preferred by white-faced ibis, but the use of center pivots and more efficient irrigation practices, we're trying to see how that affects their migration. So here, we are attaching one of those GPS transmitters to the back of a bird, and they are solar charged. So we have to make sure that that transmitter stays upright on the back of the ibis. And we do that by this bungee cord. We tie it into place, and then we also have to super glue it, the knot that is, to prevent it from rotating around the bird's chest or up under a wing, all while trying to avoid impairment of flight. So they do preen them into their feathers, so they're not always that obvious. You can't spot one from a distance very likely, but we always want to make sure that that stays center on that bird's back. So just letting that dry, keeping it out of the feathers. And we capture these at the same time we capture ducks, again, to minimize disturbance. Oh. And then here's the result of the transmitters we put out last year. We did expect birds, of course, to migrate south in the fall and heading towards their winter destinations. But there are always some interesting movements. You can see a bird found its way over to Louisiana and decided to stay there for a while. But really, this is a novel research project. And we're just interested in seeing how Mud Lake fits into this larger continental migration. So we plan on putting another 15 transmitters out this year. And it's something we're going to be keeping an eye on, seeing the significance of Mud Lake. And then finally, the other exciting restoration effort we have going on at the Mud Lake right now is the Marty Tract restoration. This diagram shows the area that we coin, or we've called the Marty Tract. It's outlined in red, and it has a very key placement. And what it does is it connects Mud Lake to the nearby Camas National Wildlife Refuge. And collectively, those areas serve as the largest protected wetland in the Upper Snake region. So that was a very strategic acquisition on the west side, or excuse me, the east side of the management area. So like I mentioned earlier, it was acquired in 2012 with partnerships with Pheasants Forever and the NRCS. 2,615 acres were purchased. Historically, the Marty was used for cattle grazing and flooded agriculture. And then, like I mentioned, Mud Lake and Camas protect a collective 20,000 acres of continuous wetland and upland habitat. But why is it necessary to restore the Marty? Well, earlier I mentioned that there were wetland cells created in an attempt to preserve the emergent marsh that was historically on the landscape. But given, again, the change in water use and agricultural practices, we're trying to now create the highest quality habitat given our water availability. And we're going to do that through wet meadow establishment, which is ultimately going to benefit sage grouse, waterfowl, pronghorn, etc. And this restoration project, it's going to fall, or each individual task within the project is going to fall under one of these three categories. So we're going to convert former emergent wetland cells to wet meadow. We're going to expand the wetted footprint, and/or we are going to improve intact wetland cells. And the partners for the project included the Idaho National Laboratory, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act grant, the Idaho Governor's Office of Species Conservation, the Teton Regional Land Trust, and the NRCS, or Natural Resources Conservation Service. So here we have kind of a prime example of conversion on the landscape. So the former wetland cells, which are outlined in black, they served as containment cells for emergent habitat. But by removing those spoil piles and removing those barriers, we're actually able to convert those cells back into their original wet meadow, or convert it back into a wet meadow complex. And you can see by this LiDAR imaging that all this low-lying area in the purple, we're able to now regain that acreage in the form of wet meadow by removing the berms on those old wetland cells. In total, this specific example is going to gain 44 acres of wet meadow, as well as an additional 31 acres of surrounding emergent wetland. So that's going to be like some of your low-lying Baltic rush, salt grasses, things like that. And as you can imagine, removing all that dirt is going to leave a lot of bare space. So now we have to come back in and reseed the area. So we went in with a no-till drill, seeded in a native wetland mix or semi-wetland mix, depending on the cell. Went ahead, got that drilled, but then we also have to ensure that those seeds germinate. So we temporarily had to run mainline from the existing water delivery ditch to a variety or several sets of hand line, which, again, if you know anything about irrigation, hand line is work. But we run those sets every 2 days for 4 hours just to ensure that that surface layer stays moist and is optimal for germination. So then here's an example of expansion. The blue lines indicate current water delivery ditches, and the yellow indicates, let's go through this. And the yellow indicates historic infrastructure that was used by the former landowner. So what we're attempting to do is now reincorporate that historical infrastructure to expand our wetted footprint. That shaded area in blue would all be gained through the expansion, and then you can see down here next to that E5 cell, there's also additional acreage there. We do also have the potential to gain acreage down here kind of in the bottom center, and that's not shown on the diagram, but at the very least, we're expecting probably 53.5 acres of new emergent marsh habitat. So through the use of that historic infrastructure. And then here we have a model that demonstrates how that water is going to move across the landscape without barriers and through the use of those historic infrastructure ditches. We've looked at these models given certain percentages of loss, but here we see, given 3 inlets, how that water is going to maneuver or navigate the depth and the elevation across the landscape. So you can see like that bottom basin, it filled really quick. The top also did. And then because of the depth, this center is going to take a tad longer, but all the while it's still filling in these other areas. So we've looked at this using a variety of technologies, and we feel confident that the water is going to move across the landscape like it once did. We'll speed you up here. You can see finally, once it pools up enough, it is going to capture that area in the middle. And then finally, tasks in this restoration are going to look to improve existing wetland cells or wetland cells that are still intact today. And the first way that we're going to do that is through the use of improved water delivery structures or water control structures. In this case, most of them, actually all of them, they're precast. They're able to be built to a tighter spec or tighter tolerance. And they're also going to speed up the restoration project because they're on site, ready to be installed as soon as the earthwork's done. So that's one way that we're going to improve existing cells, all to prevent erosion, which you can kind of see there on that left picture. Our soils are very sandy, so without proper water control features, ditches and structures quickly get eroded. This is another prime example of improvement. This cell here was functioning very well. In fact, it was probably the most intact wetland left on the Marty. But you can see to the south of it there's this dike that actually separates it from an additional 5 acres. So what we did to improve this wetland was we came in and we actually cut this berm here in the middle and added another water control structure, which now allows these 2 wetlands to be managed individually but function as one collective unit. So we really just tapped into some unused potential of that cell and picked up that additional 5 acres. Road work was also improved. As you can imagine, there's a lot of leftover dirt when you're moving or removing berms from hundreds of acres of upland. So some of the road infrastructure was also improved, which ultimately is going to allow for better movement and upkeep of these cells. These pictures demonstrate how we topped that berm like I was mentioning to you. And some of that dirt was then used to corral the lower berm that's going to contain that water for us. So I mentioned that this landscape is very large, and because we're going ultimately for a mosaic effect, a diverse landscape, if you will, there are some portions of the project that are going to incorporate all 3 of those ideas. So this cell here, it was functioning as an alkali flat or a kind of a barren basin that was used for roosting and things like that. But we were able to convert that flat to wet meadow. And we were also able to convert the water depth there. So rather than it being deep water, we were able to spread that water out across a larger area. So it's going to function more as like a sheet flow effect. Get more water to more acres. But like I said, that's going to increase our acreage through expansion. And that was done through the removal of that spoil pile. So you can see here in this upper right picture, those berms, they're now being brought back in to allow that water to flow more freely across the landscape. And in doing so, we're also going to improve the microtopography of that wetland cell, which means it's no longer just a flat bottom. There's going to be different elevations in there, different contours, which as the water on that cell dries, it's actually going to pool up in separate locations, collecting insects, microinvertebrates, forage for birds and other wildlife. So another thing that does for us is it improves our bank structure. So it's no longer as steep. It's going to be quite a bit more gradual. And then the irregularity of that bank, again, is going to improve the roosting potential and the inability of predators to visualize their prey. So all in all, it's a converted and expanded and an improved wetland cell. So that concludes the presentation, but I hope that it did give you some insight on our day-to-day activities at Mud Lake, as well as our current restoration and research projects. Are there any questions? We'll start in the back. We'll work our way forward. Yeah, so like we saw in that pie chart, fishing is a popular activity. Species that you're going to find at Mud Lake include largemouth bass, yellow perch, bullhead catfish, and then we have as many chubs as you want to catch. So those are kind of the 4 species people are looking for. So they have done well. We haven't stocked them recently, but I've heard of several like upper 30-inch muskie that have been caught this year. So they're still in. Any others? Yes. Oh yeah, the swimming traps. Yeah. So oh yeah, until you tip over in the mud. Yeah, those swimming traps, they are effective, but the only problem with them, other than the mud, is they require a lot of effort. Like you have to check them every day, every so many hours. And at the time or at the moment, I'm the only technician at Mud Lake. So if you can imagine trying to oversee all those swimming traps would be a chore. But yes, they are efficient. Any others? In the middle. Yep. So we do utilize other resources to accomplish things at Mud Lake. Master naturalists, they come out and they do several surveys for us a year. Other projects as well. But then in addition to that, we do have neighboring wildlife management areas that when needed, those technicians come help me or I can go help them. But yes, we do look for other opportunities or other ways to get outside help on these projects. White hat. So this is just a stock PowerPoint picture. We don't have a lot of conifers at Mud Lake or Camas Creek, but we are trying to build up some of those wet meadow habitats similar to what you're seeing here. Yes. So the project has been in the works, I'd say, for at least the last 3 years, all the planning and the engineering, the consulting. We just started dirt work this year. So we haven't seen an increased use yet, but several of those cells or several of those wetland basins are complete. So we're now kind of in that revegetating stage. And I would imagine by this fall, we should have water functioning on the landscape in time for that fall migration. So we'll start seeing it this fall, hopefully. So increased use of species, but then one thing I mentioned sage grouse several times, the Table Butte sage grouse population, which is to our northeast, they've been known to be in decline for several years now. So we're hoping that through the use of these wet meadows, we might see an increase in that Table Butte population, which would be an indicator of success on Mud Lake restoration. Any others? Yes. Yeah, so I showed that one LiDAR image. We've used or we've utilized LiDAR several times. And really what that does is it confirms suspicion. So we had those historic water delivery systems in place, that historic infrastructure. And by overlaying it with technology such as LiDAR, we're able to confirm the suspicion that, yep, that would get water where it needs to go. It's going to allow it to flow historically, essentially. So LiDAR, and then of course modeling and things like that help us predict acreage. Yes. No, you're good. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yep. They are very keen on seeking out flooded agriculture. You do occasionally see them in a center pivot, but it's always right under the sprinkler. Yep. They have to concentrate under that sprinkler in order to feed efficiently. Yep. Or that. That's true. Yep. Yeah. If they have flooded field corners, which farmers often implement. I got the crew right here. So, yep, that IBIS research project is something we're excited for, and seeing how Mud Lake fits into that greater continental landscape. So, go for it. Yeah, so if you guys wanted to get involved with some of the work Fish and Game's doing, you can just call into the regional office. We do have several systems in place. We have a volunteer coordinator, for instance, that would be happy to guide you guys in the right direction, get you guys involved. But yeah, I mean, you can imagine with 11,000 acres, there's always something to be done, but always welcome to help. All righty. Yeah, no problem.